Hi class, and welcome back to another lecture for Psych 101. Today we're going to go over Chapter 7, which is actually two separate chapters in my old book, so I had to combine a lot of material to put this in one. Given the fact that this is going to be a lot of material that I'm presenting here, what I would suggest is pulling very heavy from this lecture specifically, and using the book as much more of a supplemental resource to just double check anything you might not catch. More or less, right, focus on this chapter in this video rather than the book. So hopefully that's helpful to some of you. But going over a plan of action today, we have a lot of stuff to cover, right? Thinking and intelligence. It's kind of wild that I have to break this down into a single chapter. Well, the book also brings up this idea of language, which I think is a part of thinking and intelligence that we should speak about. So we'll talk about that for a little bit. Then we'll talk about cognition and how we reason about things. Actually, what we'll spend the majority of time in here is not talking about thinking, but actually about maybe our biases and how we think and mental shortcuts we take in order to help us make decisions faster and easier. Then we'll move on to this idea of intelligence. So what is intelligence? We'll talk about some of the intelligence tests from history and present, and we'll talk briefly about the influences of intelligence, and finally end with theories of intelligence. But let's start with this idea of language basics. Well, human language is what we call an open and symbolic communication system, right? It's open in the sense that it's dynamic and it's free to change. And what we mean by symbols is, right, the noise coming out of our mouths, we translate into letters and words and things, which are simply symbols, right? All of these words down here, right, mean hello in whatever language they're speaking, but they are different in terms of the symbols and what they actually mean. There's also technically differences in the ways that you say hello, right? Like hello, hey, how's it going? All of those are, right, open, kind of open differences in language. Now we can also talk about this idea of grammar and allowing us to express these abstract and distant ideas. Just take a moment and imagine what life would be like if we couldn't actually talk about things that weren't right in front of us and explain what they were. How would we do things like explain this concept of freedom, right? Understanding that this might be a little difficult. But when we talk about language, we know that open language is dynamic and we see it change all the time. For instance, one example of a word that has found a new meaning recently, right? Throwing. Normally in class, I have people say, what are some other ways you say throwing? Toss something, right? But the one that's kind of come up nowadays is yeet, right? You can think that Kobe is for accuracy and precision, where yeet is actually for power and distance. If you want to throw something hard, you got to yell yeet. And then we also talk about this idea of symbolic, where most words have no connection between the sounds they make and what they actually mean. However, there are some words that do, right? Onomatopoeias, but that's something right, more for English class than this. But let's talk about how our language is built. Our language is built based on micro units, which we would call phonemes, that gradually work themselves up into bigger and more advanced kind of groupings. So a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound with meaning, right? Single letters like ah or b, right? Those aren't words, but they are noises, and they have meaning, and they add meaning to different things we can say. Right, long or short vowels, I said ah, but it could be a, right? Cat versus cake. And then these consonant blends are actually considered, right, single sounds. Th or sh is going to be a single sound. Really weird to be doing that on a microphone instead of in person. But with these, a phoneme, right, being the smallest unit of sound, these differ by language, right? There are some languages which have different phonemes, which for instance, we might not be able to pronounce as pure English speakers. Other languages might have difficulty. I know the one that many people know is that people who grow up learning only Japanese often struggle to differentiate their R's and their L's in the English language, because that is a phoneme not native, we would say, in Japanese. Young kids, though, are able to recognize all types of phonemes, and this only lasts until about 9 months. This makes a lot of sense, though. Why? Well, because children are trying to pick up the language that they speak, and by 9 months, you should have heard just about every sound in your language that you would need to hear. Now, you can pick up these sounds later, but it might not be as easy to do. Moving on to this idea of morphemes. Morphemes are the smallest unit of language. Now we're talking about language with meaning. And these are often combinations of phonemes, right? Words like run or wed, right? We can also talk about prefixes, right? Like unwed, right? That's two morphemes combined. Things like suffixes, right? Running is again two phonemes, morphemes, run being one and ing being another. And there are certain words that can just be phonemes, as we said as well. Now, moving on to that, we can talk about words in general, right, which are combinations of morphemes. So this can be, right, larger than just a single word, right? Running, unwed, those are combining multiple morphemes to make words. Then with words, unsurprisingly, you get phrases and sentences, right? The dog is running. Now, these rely on something, though, called syntax, which determines how we can make sense of this. The dog is running. So say it's the dog is running around the house. What does that mean, right? Is the dog running inside the house and through the rooms, or is the dog running outside around the house? And this is the concept of semantics, right? The rules that govern a meaning to a sentence, right? So when you hear the dog is running around the house, where do you picture the dog? Is it inside the house, or is it outside running laps around the house? And that does matter, right? We can run into issues here when our semantics aren't exactly what we want them to be. So when it comes to this idea of semantics, we run into two issues. The first is this idea of a surface structure. So what the word strings produced mean, right? So this is pretty obvious, right? The idea of where, the dog is running around the house. But there's this deep structure as well, which are abstract relationships, right? Why one sentence might have two meanings. So for instance, the phrase, students cook and serve grandparents. On the surface, right, the words are fine. But when you think about the second meaning of that, it takes on a darker turn. Same with this one. Have the kids shot for dad for $24.95. Boy, that's cheap. I really like this one, right? If you got to give your kids some shots the day they're born, hey, it's his birthday. Might as well party. So that is a good example of this kind of basics of language. Now, in terms of language development, like many things with children, this comes in steps. Now, you don't need to know exactly which steps these are, but right, for the first 6 months of life, there's usually a little bit of cooing followed by some babbling, and we see this kind of move onwards from a one-word to a two-word to a sentence stage after about 3 years. It takes us a while to develop language. Right? So we do know, right, this babbling, kind of just like blah, 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 my daughter's about to hit here in a couple months, right? This is going to be the first kind of step in language. But recently I learned that you can teach kids some pretty basic like signing at 4 months or so, right? So this means more, that you can teach your kid, right? So if you give them, right, the bottle and you say, do you want more? And they go like this. You can be pretty sure they want more. So while language might take a while to communicate, we still can communicate with kids even before that. But how is language learned, right? How do we go about teaching kids language? Well, let's talk about 3 different perspectives. So the first one is this idea of behaviorist perspectives. Well, early researchers believe that children can learn any language the way they learn any other skill, right? This is just reinforcement, punishment, shaping, extinction, all the great stuff from our chapter on learning. But this isn't always correct, right? There's some issues. Parents typically respond to kids with their content over their grammar, right? If your kid says, nobody like me, the parents will probably say, I like you. The parent doesn't, right, punish you for saying, nobody likes you, right? You go, nobody like me. And you go, well, of course nobody likes you because it's likes me, not like, right? You're not going to be mean to your kid like that. You're going to, right, ignore some of those mistakes. And oftentimes kids overgeneralize. I run to the store, not I ran to the store, suggesting that there is something else going on that's making them think that run is a more likely kind of past tense of run than ran is. And this shouldn't happen if we take a behaviorist perspective, because that should be either instantly eliminated or a kid wouldn't understand how to generalize that rule. Now, we can also talk about the nativist view. Many of you might know this guy by his name, Noam Chomsky. And the idea with the nativist view is that language develops as an innate and biological capacity. And some evidence of this is that deaf babies actually are able to babble when they can't hear. In the same way that blind kids can smile, deaf babies will make noise even though they're unable to hear it. And what's interesting is without grammatical syntax, without anything, especially with new words or words we might make up, children will create their own, right? So if I ask you what the past tense of blorp is, you would probably say blorped. But what if I told you it was blarp in the same way that run is ran? You could make that up, but most kids go by our common syntax, right? So, he, she, they blorped. That would be what we're talking about here. But with this, right, it makes it a little bit easier to learn complex grammar because overgeneralizing rules is usually much more effective because we know for the vast majority of the things we learned, adding ed to the end of a word often does create the past tense of it. Now, rund isn't correct, but hey, you're not going to be right every time. And we know that there are these universal stages of language development, things like babbling, and that is for any kids, as we said, even deaf children. So the other option we can talk about is what we call an interactionist period, where both environment and biology are going to play this important role. And this is due to what we call a critical period or a sensitivity period. And the idea is that in a sensitivity period, if children aren't exposed to any human language before a certain age, they've missed the window, more or less, right? They shouldn't be able to fully develop language. Now, Jeannie is a special case who I've talked about in some of my classes. In 1970s, Jeannie, at the age of 13, was discovered in California. She suffered from severe abuse due to her parents. She was locked into a room and tied to a potty chair and beaten for vocalizing or making noises. This was due to her dad had a lot of issues, to say the least. She was born what we call neurotypical, right? But by 13, she was nearly mute. She knew 20 words in a few phrases, right? She didn't recognize that stop it, for instance, was 2 words. It was almost like STOPIT, just 1 word to her, or no more, or no, things like this. She did have, but I can't share the video for this, but if you are interested in looking up Jeannie, a lot of research was done with Jeannie, and they found that through a lot of intensive training, she was able to learn a little bit of language. But she wouldn't be able to hold a conversation like you and I can, suggesting that there is this critical period that, if passed, it makes it very difficult to learn a language. Now, as many of you learned a second language through high school, you can, but if you don't have that kind of schema or framework for a first language, it becomes even more difficult to do. So some takeaways from what we're talking about here, right? Language is open, it's dynamic, it changes, it modifies itself, in that we're really good at learning languages. It seems to be environmental and it's both the nature and the nurture, we can say. But there does seem to be this critical period in which language helps humans fully develop. So a little bit about language there, but let's go ahead and move on to cognition and reasoning. So I will say I'm a little biased as a social cognitive psychologist. I love cognition. I think it's really cool. In cognition, what we mean by that is just this idea of a mental activity of some sort that goes on in the brain when a person is processing information. That's really vague. So what do we mean by that? Well, we can organize information. We can understand what's being said, and then we're able to communicate it to others. In the same way we talked earlier about this kind of black box, right? We put info in, something happens in our brain, and we get a response out. Now, the other option, or the other thing we can talk about here is reasoning. So the process of drawing what we call inferences or conclusions from things, whether those be principles, facts we know, events we see, evidence we have. And there's 2 ways that we can do reasoning. The first of which we call formal reasoning, where we follow steps, step by step, to reach valid conclusions. And these are called algorithms. Algorithms are step-by-step problem-solving procedures that are guaranteed to return a solution. But that's very, very time consuming, right? So for instance, if you forgot your PIN, right, to access your bank account or whatever, what you could do is you could start at 000. Oops, need 4 zeros there. And then, right, try that one. Okay, that doesn't work. 0001. Okay, that doesn't work either. And you can start, right, step by step, trying each different combo, starting at 000 all the way to 9999, which you better hope you didn't make your PIN 9999, to find your valid solution. But we don't always think that way. We think of a different way often, and this is an informal reasoning. And these are called heuristics. And heuristics are a very, very useful thing to understand because it helps us to recognize why people make mistakes a lot of times in decisions or where they can make mistakes. And heuristics are basically more or less just these time-saving mental shortcuts. And they make us able to understand things a lot faster. For instance, your PIN, you might jump immediately to understanding something or to thinking about something like, well, usually I do things like my birthday, so why don't I try my birthday or my cat's birthday or whatever? And right, that might be, say, just picking a date. What's late in the year? No, that's too late in the year. Man, I should have hit pause on here. Like if it was September 15th, say, and your number was, right, 9150, I guess it could be 0915, which wouldn't be that bad. Well, anyways, you would have still saved yourself about 900 numbers typing into the PIN in order to get that. But there's a lot of different types of heuristics. But really what I want you to know here is, actually ignore the bottom part, is this idea that these are rules of thumb and they're making us to make quick, imperfect judgments. One example of this is, right, if you're not sure what, right, say you hear a loud noise outside, and you're not sure what it is, you might, instead of thinking through all the possibilities, you might jump immediately to a certain solution that makes sense to you. Oh, that's probably my neighbor because he leaves right around this time every day, right? Now that could be wrong, but it's probably a good bet, and that's why you might use a heuristic. So I'm going to talk about a couple different heuristics here, and more or less, I want you to just be able to describe what these are. However, I will give some, what I like to think, pretty good answers and solutions here. This is one of my favorite things to do in class. It's a shame we're not going to have this, but we'll try our best here. So the first one I'd like to talk about is the anchoring and adjusting heuristic. And this one, if you understand what I mean by anchoring and adjusting, makes a lot of sense. We tend to use what we consider basically an estimation. So say you're looking for a house. You don't really know how much a house should cost in the neighborhood. So what will happen is you'll come upon a number, right? Maybe the first house you see is worth $100,000. Pretty cheap house. That will give you a kind of a starting point, what we would call an anchor, right? So we might get this anchor, and then we might use that as our starting point and adjust from there. So then you see another house worth $200,000. You go, well, I found one for 100, and 200 is way too different. So I'm maybe looking for ones that are like 150 to, right, maybe down at the lower end, 75,000. So this idea is this anchor might make us more linked to a certain number. Here, this example talks about, right, the average price of German cars, right, is it more or less than $100,000? Well, that number, $100,000, is your anchor here. It seems really high, right? So you would say, well, I don't think it's that high, it's probably lower. But then if I said, well, do you think it's higher or lower than $20,000? Well, on the other hand, that anchor is too low, so you have to adjust somewhere up and in the middle. Now, what's very interesting, though, is say that the average price of German cars is, and I don't know this, let's say $75,000. If I give you this first, do you think the average price of German cars is lower than $20,000? You'd say, no, that's too low. Then I might say, well, what do you think it is? Your anchor is right here, $20,000. So you might say, probably like $45,000. That makes sense. That's a new car. Okay. But if I started you out at the $100,000 number, you would agree, well, that's too much. It's probably lower. But maybe you'd be more likely to adjust down to like, $60,000. And that difference, right? You're not making the same adjustment based on these numbers, but these numbers are helping you to anchor yourself to a certain point at the very beginning. So the anchoring and adjustment heuristic works, again, by allowing us to take this first number as a rough estimate, to anchor ourselves to it, and then use that to find other numbers. Beyond that, I talk about the availability heuristic. And the availability heuristic is pretty simple when you think about the name. What's available in your mind, right? And we tend to judge things based on how easy examples come to mind. It's a well-known fact that flying is much safer than driving. But when we see things like the news focused on airplanes, right, that maybe go down, you're more likely to think how dangerous an airplane is and overestimate how dangerous that is and underestimate how dangerous driving in a car is, right? You might never want to go on a boat because you saw the movie Titanic, right? That is a very available, we might say, judgment or kind of example that comes to mind. So you might judge boats as less safe. But the availability heuristic can really be best described, though, as just how quickly something comes to mind based on what's available. So I'm going to do a little math problem with you, and I would encourage you to stop between steps. I know this is going to sound silly when we're watching at home. I would encourage you to do this. I think it's a pretty fun one, and you shouldn't have to do too much math. So what I want you to do is just think of a number between 1 and 9. Let's go ahead and do that. And I am going to talk through these pretty quick, so I would encourage you to pause after each step if you're a slow person with math like myself. So think of a number between 1 and 9. Now, subtract 5 from that number. Even if it's negative, that's totally fine. Now multiply that new number by 3, which, as you should know, will get rid of the negative sign. Now multiply that number by itself. Now this step can be a bit confusing. Add the digits of this new number until you get a 1-digit number. So for instance, if you got the number 46, you would add 4 plus 6. 4 plus 6 equals 1, 0, 10. 1 plus 0 equals 1. So you now have the number 1. So if you have like the number 225, add 2 plus 2 plus 5, you have 9. Okay? Now check your number. Is this number less than 5? If it's less than 5, add 5 to it. Otherwise, subtract that number by 4. Now multiply that new number by 2. Subtract 6. And now we come to the part where you have to be pretty quick. So I'm going to ask you to do this after this. Make sure you have the right number. Double check your number and map that number to a letter in the alphabet. So if it's 1, if your number is 1, choose A. If your number is 2, choose B, 3, C, 4, D, 5, E, etc. Now, I'm going to ask you for 3 things quickly and just keep them in your mind when I ask. Think of a country that begins with whatever letter you just chose, right, based on your number. Now take the second take the second letter of that country's name and think of a mammal specifically, that begins with that letter. And think of the color of that mammal. Now, if you did this right, you likely chose a gray elephant from Denmark. And no, I can't read minds, but this is just the availability heuristic at work. So how does this work? Well, first of all that fancy math is to trick you into making the number 4 come up and making it seem like you chose that number. Now, if we think about words that are available or countries that are available, with D, Denmark is a frequently available country. For those of you who chose the Dominican Republic, ostriches nor octopi, or octopodes is how they're actually called as a plural, those are not mammals. So you're also wrong. E, Denmark, DE, elephant is a common mammal that comes to mind. And gray is typically the color of mammals. Gray is the color of elephants, specifically gray elephants, although there are pink elephants. That is true. So this is a great example of the availability heuristic because what I'm doing is simply preying on what is most likely the available information to you. And this is how a lot of mentalists work. This idea is they just kind of have you tuned in to something that most people think of? In the same way that if I say peanut butter, you mostly think jelly, right? This is just what is available to us. So I love the availability heuristic, and if that did work, let me know. If it didn't, I'm actually surprised, and tell me what you got instead. Moving on to the representativeness heuristic. Now, this is kind of interesting because more or less this is the idea of stereotyping, that we have a tendency to classify things according to how similar it is to what we consider a typical case, or the book also calls a prototype, right? So our prototypical understanding of a certain thing. Now, one example of this is if I told you that Joe is 41, not overweight, he wears glasses and reads poetry, he's a truck driver or an Ivy League, is he a truck driver or an Ivy League English professor? Well, most of you would probably immediately say he's much more likely to be a truck driver. And that makes sense. Or he's much more likely to be an English professor. Hopefully you guys said an English professor. Excuse me, I apparently need another sip of coffee. But let's do the math here, right? Let's just say there are 3 million truck drivers in the United States. And let's give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that 2 million of them are overweight and only 1 million of them are not overweight. So Joe being 41, he's still a 1 in a million shot here. 50% of truck drivers have glasses. Let's go ahead and say that for the sake of the argument. And that leaves us with 500,000. Now, there's got to be some truck drivers out there who like poetry. Let's say it's 1% of truck drivers who like poetry. How many does that leave us with? 5,000 truck drivers still in America who would fit this description, Joe. Now, how many Ivy League how many Ivy League colleges are there? There's 8. And let's say that every single professor in those English departments is male, just for the sake of it. We know that's not true. And let's say that there is a large number of people in an English department at these Ivy League universities. So a large number would be like 50 people. 50 times 8 is only 400. What does this mean? Well, you stereotype people a lot, right? Just because it seems more likely based on this description that he is a Ivy League English professor. Statistically, you're more likely to have this person be a truck driver. Another example of the representativeness heuristic is how this is actually done in courts, believe it or not. Just putting glasses on people makes people think that they're more intelligent and less likely to commit crimes, believe it or not. Suggesting that, right, we just go with what we think is representative of that person. What is representative of intelligence on a lot of TV shows, movies? The guy who has glasses. So we might just use that instead of really thinking about it, because it might take a lot more effort to describe it in detail. So that is the idea of this representativeness heuristic, or we look at what is most representative. And this is going to, again, be different than the availability heuristic because it's not what is most, in our mind, but it is what is most, similar to what we would consider the prototype. Moving forward, I also want to talk about the base rate fallacy. So the base rate fallacy is where we might ignore how the base rates work and focus on whether that fits into a category or not. So a good example of this is, which of the following is more likely when tossing a coin 6 times? Heads, 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 followed by tails, 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 or tails, heads, tails, tails, heads, tails. Additionally, which lottery ticket would you like to buy? The lottery ticket was 17, 43, 18, 27, 33, 35? Or would you like to buy the lottery ticket that says 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16? Most of you will say that this is more likely, and this is probably the lottery ticket you would like to buy. Now, statistically, though, are those any different? Statistically, 3 heads and 3 tails are more likely than 4 tails and 2 heads, right? 50-50. However, it doesn't look right. Head, 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 tails, tails, tails. That doesn't look right to us. Which of these lottery tickets is more likely to happen? Neither. They're the same. What happens is that People ignore how likely something actually is. 50-50, right? One in whatever number. And they focus on whether that fits the category. And we see this happen a lot, right? People might use this base rate fallacy, right? Where they think that just because they've lost several times in a row, the next one must be the winner, right? Because I can't just keep losing. I like this video, or excuse me, this image as a really good example of this, right? Where the doctor says that there's a 50% chance that if you smoke, that you will end up with cancer, right? And the person says, it'll never happen to me. But the odds of winning a Powerball are 1 in 800, or excuse me, 80 million. But he thinks it's more likely to happen to him. Statistically, it's much more likely that he's going to get cancer than win the Powerball, but this base rate fallacy causes some of these issues. The last one I want to talk about is something that many people get wrong, and I think it's really cool as to why this happens, and it's called the conjunction fallacy. So conjunctions, right? If you think of, does anybody remember conjunction junction back in the day, right? These are two things conjoined, put together. So thinking that two events are more likely to occur together than alone. So for instance, if you knew nothing about me and I walked in on the first day and I hadn't told you about me or who I am, which is more likely? 1, I'm a professor, or 2, I'm a professor who's married. Well, it's true that I'm a professor who's married, but what's more likely? Well, there's only so many professors in the world, and not every professor's married, so there has to be less married professors than professors in the world. So it's less likely that I would be a professor and married. Well, that makes sense, but people don't always think that way. So to give you an idea with this here is Linda. Linda's 31, she's single, she's outspoken, and as a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of social justice and participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Now, which of the two of these is more probable? That Linda is a bank teller, or that Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? Well, most people would argue that she's probably a banker who is also active in the feminist movement, given what we've spoken about up here. However, right, look at it this way. We have bank tellers and we have feminists. Now, sometimes we're going to have feminist bank tellers, but it's more likely that she's just a bank teller. And this is that conjunction fallacy, right? That we are conjoining bank tellers plus feminists as being more likely than a feminist or a bank teller individually. So with cognition and reasoning, really what I want to say here is how we think and how we reason and how we understand is through these mental shortcuts, oftentimes. They help us to get through the day in a quick and easy fashion, right? If you lost your keys, you wouldn't start in the back corner of the house and search under everything using an algorithm. You would use a heuristic. You would go back to the last couple places you were to try to find them, right? And this is very valuable to us, and it helps us to make proper decisions. Now, proper decisions are an important part of our everyday life, but what else is important is our intelligence and how we think. And with intelligence, usually how I start this is I ask people to tell me some kind of words they use to describe intelligent people other than intelligent, right? Smart, clever, knowledgeable, understanding, probably a couple other words you can think of. And then I ask people to name me people who they think are intelligent, right? And sometimes people come up with scientists, billionaires, TV hosts. We can think about artists being intelligent. Other individuals we can say who maybe are very impactful, we also think are very intelligent. And it brings up this question of what is intelligence and how do we define our idea of intelligence? Well, it's hard to agree on a definition of intelligence because intelligence has a lot of different things that come together. Reasoning, remembering, understanding, right? We have to be able to solve problems. We have to make decisions. We have to have knowledge. We have to have a memory, right? This is a mental ability. Intelligence can be described as a mental ability we have that enables us to direct our thinking, adapt to different circumstances, and learn from our experiences. So your book doesn't actually give you a definition of what intelligence is, so I'm going to use the book definition from the last book I used. a set of cognitive skills that includes abstract thinking, reasoning, problem solving, and the ability to acquire knowledge. These are all parts of intelligence, right? Intelligence is a very broad construct, and it's continuously changed over the years. And one question people ask is, right, does intelligence change over time? Well, within a person, yes, and we also know between people. People have been getting smarter and smarter as the years go on. But within yourself, do you think your intelligence can change? Do you think you can be better at math if you're not good at it? Or do you think you can become a good writer? Well, you can. The interesting thing is this is called mindset theory. And mindset theory, done by Carol Dweck, part of my dissertation came from this research, is this idea of fixed versus growth mindsets. And that people who focus on this growth mindset, believing that ability can be developed, even their intelligence. People who embrace challenges and continue at obstacles, see effort as necessary to overcome these things and learn from their criticism, are going to learn how to do things better. Practice makes perfect in the same kind of way. Now, people who think that, well, I'll just never be good at math, say, they're going to avoid any challenging math problems. They're going to give up easy. What's the point? Right? See this as completely useless and ignore criticism because why does it matter? Right? So when it comes to intelligence, right, what we know is that it can change and it can get better over time if you are somebody who is attempting to make it better. However, not everybody does. So intelligence is something that is constantly changing in terms of kind of the psychological definition, or it's still in flux, we'll say. And throughout history, we've used different intelligence tests correctly and incorrectly to help us understand where people fall. Because this is an important understanding, right? Where do people fall on this idea of mental ability? Now, the first kind of history, in the history of intelligence tests, the first person we got to talk to about is a man named Alfred Binet. And Alfred Binet was interested in identifying any issues with school children who had problems learning. And so he had a couple of assumptions here that intelligence deals with things like reasoning, thinking, problem solving, right? And that all of these are dependent on intelligence. He also talked about this idea of aptitude versus achievement, what you're able to achieve versus what you actually achieve. Now, this semester is a great example about aptitude versus achievement, I think. Many of us, in most normal semesters, are able to achieve the grades we want without much problem, or without too great of a problem. And that is our achievement level. However, certain circumstances, be they internal coronavirus or other external ones, maybe don't allow us to get to our full potential, right? And we only achieve a certain level during this crisis, but maybe we have an aptitude to get better grades. For instance, I'm not exactly thrilled with teaching online. It has certainly gimped my ability to teach in the way I want to. So I would say that my achievement level that I've gotten is not exactly as high as I would like to. But Binet, he had a very interesting idea in terms of IQ, and this is something we can still use to this day. How he made this ratio of IQ was you took your mental age based on this score of intelligence, right? So say you were in 10th grade and you got a mental age of 15, or excuse me, I guess, say you were 10 years old and you got an intelligence score of a 15-year-old. So your mental age would be 15 divided by your physical age. That's 1.5 times 100. You have an IQ of 150. If you have the IQ of 150, you are well in genius range. So most people do not, right, fall too far out of this. I would suggest if you have questions about how high or low intelligence goes, the book does a great job explaining that, talking about things like the bell curve. And if you are a psych major, understand that the bell curve is going to be the backbone to your understanding of statistics. So might as well learn it now. But the bell curve more or less is going to tell you that most people fall in this range between, 90 to 110 in terms of their intelligence, their IQ score. But a couple years later, in terms of this intelligence test, Lewis Terman came along and added items for adults, right? Supply missing words to incomplete sentences, or repeat 6-digit numbers I give you in reverse order, right? 257938. Now give me that number backwards. Create a sentence using several unrelated words. Right? Belt, dog, library, house. Make a sentence using those words. In my house, I have a belt. It's where my dog lives, and he sleeps in the library. There's a sentence. Describe similarities between concepts. Things like, right, explain to me, right, actually one of the questions is, why would somebody have fire insurance? And, right, the reason is because if your house burns down, you, right, are insured against that. But there's some problems with this version of intelligence test, and I think they can be best described by one of the original intelligence test questions, right? An Indian, or in our case, we would call this a Native American, has come to town and for the first time in his life saw a white man riding along the street. As the man rode by, the Indian said, "The white man is lazy. He walks sitting down." What was the white man riding on that caused the Indian to say he walks sitting down? Right? Is it a horse? No, that's not the correct answer. Is he being carried by somebody else? No. A wheelchair? No. The only correct answer to this question was a bicycle, which seems a little silly, right? Is that truly a measure of intelligence? If I asked every single one of you, right, during class, can you tell me what my birthday is? And you don't get it right, am I really right to say you have a low intelligence? Probably not, right? There's some issues with how we can talk about intelligence testing throughout the years, and they're only going to get worse as we go on. So a couple years later, Henry Goddard came out with the Army intelligence test, and there were two types of intelligence tests for the Army for World War I recruits. There was the Army Alpha test, which was done in English, and then there's the Army Beta test, not somebody who doesn't read or speak English. Now, what I will say here is that for this, the alpha test was pretty much the same as what you would expect from the other questions we've already talked about. But how do we test people about their intelligence if they don't speak our language? Well, what you might do is look at things like objects or mazes. And what they were told to do was describe the missing, right? What is missing from each one of these? And you can go through here and figure it out yourself. A couple ones that people get stuck on frequently. Pause the video if you don't want to see these, I guess. For instance, you're missing the trigger on the gun. You are missing the little spirally thing here. I can't think of its name. Missing the strings on the violin. Missing the top of the chimney here. Right? He's missing an ear. He's missing a wire. And the rest of them, right? Stamp. Should be able to figure out the rest. But a good example of a question from the Army test would be something like this. Who's the person on a $50 bill? Now, many of you probably don't know that it's Grant himself. But even if you did know, right, this would be like asking us, who's on this bill? Like, I don't even know what country this is, man, right? I don't live there. Or if you've newly immigrated to America, what's the chances you've seen a $50 bill back in 1918? Probably very little to none. So there was probably some issues with this Army test because they found that just about half of everybody scored at a mental age of 13 or less. So did we really just send a bunch of recruits off to World War I who were actively deficient in terms of their cognition? No, there's probably some issues with that test. And not only that, this test was used to identify immigrants who we would consider were mentally defective. And based on this test, from the year 1980 to the year 1890 to 1915, the mental age of immigrants actually declined. So people often thought that this was kind of stupidity more than anything. But in reality, this is a great example of a third variable problem, or actually just a better example of a poorly designed test, probably one that's not very reliable, nor is it accurate, to say the least. So again, probably not that people were letting dumber and dumber people in the Army. It's that there was an issue with the Army test. So one thing to recognize is that IQ tests are not perfect. Thinking about IQ tests as perfect is a very, very bad idea. Intelligence means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I really like the quote that if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, right, it will live its whole life thinking it's stupid. Another image I've seen here, right, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And you've got a bird, a penguin, a monkey, an elephant, a fish in a bowl, a dog, and a seal. Only about half of those are going to be able to be, right, or be able to climb a tree, but I'm sure they're very efficient in other aspects as well. So recognizing that intelligence isn't exactly the only way we can measure things, and that if we are going to use intelligence, we better make sure we're using the right kind of test. Our boy Henry Goddard also came into some other issues here. He argued that IQ is strongly hereditary, that how smart your parents were was a huge factor in how smart you are. We know that to be partially true, but not completely. And he actually believed that this idea of feeble-mindedness was a recessive gene, and that individuals who were feeble-minded by his description ought to be sterilized and not be allowed to have children. The concept of eugenics. In the Supreme Court, actually upheld what they called Buck v. Bell. This was a 1927 case that the United States Supreme Court ruled that compulsory or forced sterilization of mentally, as they called them, mentally retarded, for the protection of the health of the state was completely okay. And this law applied until how late do you think? The answer, 1972. 7,500 people were sterilized due to some psychological tests that were probably not valid. This is what it means to talk about ethics issues in psychology, right? Most of these people weren't even deficient by today's standards. They were mostly people who were prostitutes or had disciplinary problems, individuals who were unwed mothers or petty criminals, right? Stealing small amounts of things. This is a really dark moment in psychology's history, a lot of what this is, because it was backed up by science. And it really explains why we care so much about making sure we are running ethical studies to this day. So I like to keep that in mind for people and allow them to remember that and the importance of that, we'll say. But today, we now look at things a little differently. We might measure aptitude tests, as we mentioned before, being able to tell a person's cognitive readiness, versus achievement tests, what you've actually mastered and been able to do. Now, intelligence tests are different than these two types of tests because they are trying to measure IQ objectively in a standardized fashion. Now, as we saw, there's many issues with trying to measure these in a standardized fashion. And actually, we know that some of these tests, the SAT, one of the best predictors of the SAT is how much money your parents make. Are you able to get a tutor? Are you able to take other classes? Is that really a fair measurement of cognitive aptitude? Maybe. Probably not, because we're not putting on everybody on the level playing field. So, how do we make a good measure of intelligence, right? We know it has so many properties, all of these things. And here's that book definition again. So, what I suggest you be able to know is some of the different ways that we can look at intelligence in the modern era. And we often use what is called the WAIS, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. This is much more modern, and it includes two components, verbal and performance. This depends a lot less on your schooling, right? This isn't going to ask you factual questions necessarily. I mean, you should be able to know some basic facts, like, right? I remember taking an IQ test in third grade, and they asked me what day the Declaration of Independence was signed. But we can look at this as a bit more broad. So with our verbal IQ, we can talk about verbal comprehension. So looking at different vocabulary words, being able to compare similarities or comprehend certain passages we might read. We might also look at our working memory, right? Our short-term memory. Are you able to do basic arithmetic? Are you able to count back digits, right? So I'm going to give you I'm going to just keep reading you digits. And at some point I'm going to say, stop. What was the digit I said 2 digits ago? Right? This letter number sequencing, being able to memorize these things for a short period of time. Then on the performance side of things, we talk about perceptual organization. So being able to complete pictures, which I'll show you an example of. This block design or matrix reasoning I'll talk about as well. And then being able to kind of look at this processing speed. How quick are you at being able to figure out these symbols? So here's an example of the verbal section of this, right? What day of the year is Independence Day? Asking similarities, right? What, where, wool, and cotton alike. Being able to do basic math. If eggs cost 60 cents a dozen, what do eggs cost? 5 cents a piece. Vocabulary, tell me the meaning of corrupt. Comprehension, why do people buy fire insurance? And then these digit span, right? So being able to follow these numbers. Now on the performance scale of things, we might use picture arrangement. Put these pictures in the right order to tell a story. I always thought it would be funnier to imagine this, that the kid ran out of the house, saw the snowman, and then just like broke him down. However, right, the correct order is he runs out of the house, he begins to make the snowman, and then he finishes it. We might also have people use block designs, right? So using 4 blocks with these kind of shaded areas, make one just like this. This can take people some time, that can take them a lot of time, a little time, and this is part of this spatial awareness. Talked about object assembly, right? So this is a dog, believe it or not. And can you put these pieces together to make the dog? We can also talk about digit symbol substitution, right? So are you able to quickly, and how long does it take you to pull these codes into what it should be here, right? So we've got 1, 5, 4, 2, 1, 3, 5, 4, 1, 5. Took me a little longer than I'd like to admit. The last one I'll talk about is these progressive matrices. I had to take this once, and it's really cool because it starts out pretty easy, right? So what's the block that's missing here? Is it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6? Go ahead and pause if you want to play along. The correct missing block is going to be 5, right? We've got, based on the colors, we've got a 3, a 1, and a 2. All right, 3, 1, 3, 1, 2, 1. We're missing the 2, and it's going to be the white one. Now, this is pretty easy, but 20 minutes into this, they get harder and harder. They are progressively more difficult. And holy crap, do they get pretty hard by the end, to the point where I actually, somebody had to give a practice intelligence test to somebody, and so I offered to do this. And by the end, I was like, can you tell me the answer to this? Because I literally can't figure it out. Right, so the further along you get, the better the measure of intelligence. So let's talk about influences on intelligence. And influences on intelligence, what makes intelligence intelligence, right? Well, part of it is your genetics. So we weren't totally wrong on that. Your parents do have a large impact on your intelligence. The environment you grow up in matters. So we know that, right, kids who grew up in an environment with like lead paint, there was a hit to, or they believe there was a hit to IQ scores for those individuals, because lead at a younger age is bad for the brain. Surprising, I know. SES matters a lot. The more money you have, the greater chance you have to make it. So, right, your parents' jobs often help you to be able to get right on your feet and do things. In the same way, right, as mentioned before, if you look at 2 people, somebody who is right working to take care of their family versus somebody who doesn't have to do those things, they can both study the same amount for the SAT, but one person might not be able to, or I should say, they might not be able to study the same amount for the SAT, or they might be able to study the same amount for the SAT, but somebody might have more time to go to a tutor if you have more money. And these also impact intelligence. So what does this actually look like? Well, this is a really interesting thing. So what we see is our correlation scores with a 1.0 correlation, meaning they're perfectly correlated. And what we see is identical twins, kids with the same DNA, raised by the same parents. Still like an 85, there's still 15% that we can't explain through just genetics. And it only goes down there. Identical twins reared apart, they still have a 0.68 positive correlation between their intelligence scores among one another, even if they're reared or raised apart. And as we go down the list, right, siblings, there's only about a 0.5 correlation, give or take, when they're raised together, and only about a 0.25 correlation when they're raised apart. And this goes all the way down to unrelated children reared apart, where there's really no measure. However, isn't this interesting? Siblings reared apart is less than unrelated children reared together. Really coming back to this idea that it might be the case that these individuals, that it is both nature and nurture. Unsurprising, I know. So I hesitated to put this next stuff in, but I think it's really important. So there's this idea coming out of a professor named Claude Steele of this idea of stereotype threat. And this, I think, is a really interesting way to understand how certain differences between races in terms of intelligence happen. And the idea is what is called stereotype threat. So in the mean number of items solved in terms of an SAT, what we can do is we can put people under what we call stereotype threat, or the threat that a stereotype is going to affect their score. For instance, when we ask both black individuals and white individuals to solve some SAT questions, which apparently it's missing the that label there, both groups of people actually score around 8 or 9 questions, with a slight but probably not statistically significant difference between African Americans and white individuals. Now, how can we end up with scores like this, though? Actually, surprisingly easy. Before the test, you simply tell people, and you can flip this around as well, it doesn't matter which race you're talking about. You can say, we know that people of your race, in this case African Americans, tend to do poorly on these types of exams, whether or not that's true. So just so you know, don't worry about that. So what is that going to do to you? Well, that's going to get you all caught up into this, like, oh, are they going to judge me because of my race now? And you might actually try harder. So you're going to try harder to do better. And what happens is, in that trying to do better and trying to work harder, you're actually shooting yourself in the foot through something called social, not loafing, this idea of social inhibition. So the idea is that you actually do worse on really difficult tasks, like taking SAT questions, when you get flustered like that, especially if you think it's going to affect your performance. So it's not just this. This happens in a lot of places. So this is the game where I get to show a lot of stereotypes and feel really awkward about it. So I guess if this is so bad, send me off to the gulag or whatever. But I think this is a good example. So other types of stereotype threat do happen. So if you have a man and a woman, and you ask them to complete math problems, and you mention that there are stereotypes typically against women in terms of their ability to do math, men do much better. Now, if you take a white male and compare them against an Asian male, both of these individuals are male, but there's a stereotype that Asians are better at math than white individuals. And if you make both races, both of these individuals will say, aware of this and have them do math problems, we see the Asian person does better. Now, what happens if we talk about a white male and an Asian female about math? Well, this depends, and this really shows you how deep stereotype threat goes. Which stereotype are you going to focus on? If you focus on the stereotype with men being better than women at math, you see you see decreases for the women, and the men typically score higher. But if you focus on the idea of race mattering here, the Asian American woman does better. Now, it's not just math, though. This can be related to other things. So taking a white and African American male, and you ask them to do this task, which is a golf task, but you tell them one of two things. This is a measure of athletic intelligence, right? So this isn't actually a measure of athletic ability, but athletic intelligence. All you got to do is say that, and typically white people do better. But if you say that this is a test of athletic ability, African Americans do better. Now that seems wrong, it seems racist, and more or less, it's a stereotype, and it is. However, what ends up happening is you get yourself too flustered and are unable to really move on from this. Stereotype threat is an incredibly interesting thing, and something that I wouldn't be surprised to see some of you writing about in your cognitive pillar paper, because it explains a whole heck of a lot. And hopefully, I know we won't be discussing this in class. If you do have questions, I would love to chat about this as well with everyone. But moving on from there, let's talk about the different theories of intelligence, which is strange because the book kind of does this in the reverse order. So is intelligence one or multiple factors? Well, it depends on what you look at. Spearman originally used this G, or general factor of intelligence, right? That all of these cognitive ability tests were positively correlated, so why would we even need to look at all of them, right? This verbal idea, this spatial idea, this quantitative ability, these are all correlated. So this is just a general measure of intelligence. But we can also talk about different special intelligences, and it's up for debate how many, but certain things like a mechanical intelligence, your spatial intelligence, your logical or arithmetical intelligence, right? And so one way to look at this is, say you've got different domains in which you're good at, right? Represented by these little light bulbs. If we measure all of these, right, this gives us a level of general intelligence. However, we might be different in certain levels of special intelligence, right? And so if we are measuring all of these with our G factor, right, we will get a good average based on all of this. However, we won't know specifically how good you are on some things or others, right? Just in the same way you can pass high school without being very good at math, right? You might be good at social studies or English, but not good at math, right? You can still pass. But what if this G is only measuring a couple of your abilities, right? What if this isn't covering everything? Well, then you're going to look a lot worse on an average with these, right? So are we really covering everything when we talk about intelligence? It's hard to say, right? Because, do we know what we're not looking for is a thing. Now, the book also talks about, and I think it's very important to mention this idea of fluid versus crystallized intelligence, because this changes depending on where you are in your lifespan. Fluid intelligence requires flexible solutions. It's movable, it changes, it's fluid. This is your raw mental ability. This is how well you're able to kind of work with that information. Are you able to recognize patterns? Are you able to pull things from different pieces together, these abstract reasons? Or are you a little bit better with crystallized intelligence, right? Things that's already involved learned skills and experience, right? Knowing vocabulary, cultural knowledge about what is going on around, being able to understand different cultures. And this tends to become more stable over time, because crystallized intelligence continues to grow throughout our lives, where fluid intelligence doesn't, as seen by this. Now, this Z-score performance means one standard deviation above the mean and one standard deviation below the mean. So recognize that, right, unsurprisingly, compared to most adults, 10-year-olds don't have exactly good performance on anything. But once we hit about 30 years, 35-ish is maybe where we hit our peak. Oh, Lord, that's terrifying to me. But what you see is that vocabulary, this crystal intelligence, keeps going up as time goes on. But these other types of memory, right, our digit span, our working memory, it stays pretty stable. But things like digit symbol coding, very fluid intelligence, goes down and down and down as time goes on. Again, really suggesting this idea that there are some issues with this. Beyond that, I just wanted to talk about two other types. One is the triarchic theory of intelligence, right? How intelligence can be seen in daily life. And the triarchic theory of intelligence talks about three types of intelligence. Analytic intelligence, which is our traditional type, this creative intelligence, and then practical intelligence. I asked people how you would test all three. And normally, right, we would think that analytical intelligence can be thought of by, can you complete a crossword puzzle? Creative intelligence, right? Are you able to make a song or come up with a rhyme or do some poetry? And then practical intelligence, this is things like, can you change a tire? What's really interesting that I didn't bring up at the beginning is that, right, when I talk about who is intelligent, we often leave out a specific group of people. We often leave out people, right, who fix our cars, who keep the world running, mechanics, plumbers, pipe fitters, people of the trades. I couldn't do any of that. If the world went to hell tomorrow and I was right on an island with people, my intelligence isn't very practical, right? It's not very useful. right? I can do stuff on a spreadsheet, I can run experiments, but if we're trying to survive, that's not exactly the most useful thing. So recognizing, right, why certain other types of intelligence might be important. So maybe with this triarchic theory, we can think about it as looking at some of these different areas here. However, right, not everything. The last thing I'll mention is the book goes into this idea of multiple intelligences theory, which I think is really useful, right? Which maybe is a way that we can determine intelligence with prodigies and savants, right? Recognizing that there are these 8 different types of intelligences. So all 8 of these types of intelligence are different than what we were talking about, and actually not the same as what the book even says, things like emotional intelligence, which is something. Now, one way we can think about this, right, again, is this idea of all of these are looking at a specific thing. So again, still, if we average them together, getting a very generalized look at intelligence, but also picking this apart. Now, that's all I have time for today. Let me go ahead and throw up the last slide. So as a reminder, office hours are available Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11:30 to 12:30. Additionally, I have those extra hours this week, which are Monday from 10 to 11:15 and Tuesday from 2 to 3:15. If those aren't your class times, you're still welcome to show up if you do have any questions. But beyond that, due before our next synchronous meeting are going to be your Chapter 7 quiz, this chapter, as well as the Chapter 11 quiz on personality. So we will not do a synchronous class for this. And also remember, the night that your next synchronous class is, that paper, your second reflection paper, will be due then. So please have that in by then. You don't want to wait that long. The additional thing is, during our next synchronous class, that will be the opening for the week-long time to take the quiz, or the exam, excuse me. And that will be the same style of exam that we had last time. Multiple choice questions on one section of the exam and open-ended essay questions on the other. However, this time I might add a couple of different types of questions, true, false, etc., on the short answer, or excuse me, on the closed answer portion. However, if you do have any questions, I encourage you to reach out to me. Happy to help in any way I can. Other than that, have a great day. Hope you're all doing well, and let's close out this semester in a good way. How about that? All right. If you need me, please let me know. Have a good one.